The owner of the luxury restaurant where I worked had been selling ordinary wine as collector-grade bottles for years. When I reported it, he threatened to have me deported because of my work visa. But he didn't know I documented every bottle and had contacts at customs and at the International Sommelier Association. There are threats that reveal more about the person making them than any confession ever could. When someone threatens you with something specific, they're telling you exactly what they believe is your weak point. They're telling you what they calculate you are afraid to lose. They are telling you, without meaning to, that they have nothing else to defend themselves with except the fear they hope to provoke in you. Mr. Fontaine looked at me from across his mahogany desk with the confidence of someone who has handled difficult situations before and resolved them in his favor, and told me it would be a shame if the immigration authority were to learn about certain irregularities in my work situation that he could or could not mention depending on how I decided to handle this matter. I listened to all of it. I told him I understood. I stood up. I left. And on the way to the parking lot, I took out my phone and started making calls he did not know I was capable of making. My name is Celeste. I am 34 years old. I am French, a sommelier certified by the Court of Master Sommeliers at the advanced level, and I have spent 11 years working in the luxury hospitality sector in 3 different countries. Wine is my technical specialty and also something closer to a vocation. There are few things in the world I find as fascinating as the way a place, a vintage year, a decision by the winemaker can translate into something you can experience with all your senses simultaneously. That passion, combined with 11 years of technical training, makes me very difficult to deceive with wine. Very difficult. Mr. Fontaine did not know that when he hired me. Or perhaps he did know and calculated that my immigration situation would keep me silent regardless of what I discovered. That calculation was the most expensive mistake of his career. The restaurant is called Chateau Mirador. It is a fine dining establishment in a city where luxury restaurants compete for a clientele that has the resources to be demanding and the connections to make or break reputations with a speed that does not exist in other markets. It holds 3 stars in the most important guide in the sector. It has a wine list that when I arrived as floor manager and head sommelier had 400 references and an average price per bottle that made some tables spend more on wine than on food. That wine list was the heart of Fontaine's business. And it was also, I discovered over time, the heart of his fraud. I arrived at Chateau Mirador 2 years ago with a work contract that sponsored my work visa, something that at the time seemed like an extraordinary opportunity, and that with time I understood was also the chain Fontaine used to ensure the loyalty, or at least the silence, of his key employees. The first months, I was focused on learning the operation, the team, the suppliers, the regular clients. It is the natural adaptation period in any position at this level. The first signs arrived in the 3rd month. It was during a private service for a group of wine collectors who had reserved the main room for a pairing dinner with specific references they had requested in advance. One of the wines requested was a Burgundy from a specific vintage that on the secondary market was priced at figures that made the bottle worth almost the value of a modest automobile. When the supporting sommelier brought me the bottle for opening, something did not add up. It was not an elaborate thought. It was instinct built on 11 years of working with high-end wine. The weight of the bottle was slightly off. The cork, when I extracted it, had a texture that did not correspond with the winery indicated on the label. And when I poured the first glass and brought it to my nose before presenting it to the client, what I found was a technically correct and competent wine, but one that was not the wine the label said it was. It was a different wine. Good. Probably 40 or 50 euros a bottle on the normal market. Presented as a wine worth several thousand. I made no move that night. I served the wine. I observed the reactions of the clients, who were people with enough experience to notice that something was not exactly as they expected, but who in the context of a luxury dinner tended to interpret the difference as natural vintage variability rather than fraud. And at the end of service, I went to the cellar. I had complete access as head sommelier, managing the inventory, verifying storage conditions, overseeing stock entries and exits were part of my responsibilities. What I found when I started examining things carefully was not visible to the naked eye. It required the kind of specific technical knowledge that 11 years of working with high-end wine and contexts where authenticity is verifiable and verified gives you. There were bottles with correct labels and incorrect contents. Not all of them. A specific fraction of the inventory of the most expensive references had been altered. The original wine had been replaced with wine of a lower category, and the bottle had been recorked with a new cork that on superficial inspection appeared original, but that under ultraviolet light, which I use as a standard verification tool, showed aging differences that did not correspond with the declared age. It was a system. Sophisticated, discreet, designed not to be detected by clients, even if they were connoisseurs, because even the best palates have limitations when the context tells them that what they are drinking is what the label promises. I started documenting that same night. With my phone and the compact camera I always carry at work for photographing labels and storage conditions, I documented every suspicious bottle. I photographed the labels, the corks, the fill levels. I took small samples from the questionable bottles using the protocol I learned in my certification for comparative analysis. I kept records of every service where high-end wines were involved, noting discrepancies between what was described on the wine list and what I could determine organoleptically. I discreetly contacted 2 trusted sommelier colleagues in other cities and sent them photos and descriptions to obtain independent technical opinions validating my observations without them knowing the full context. Both confirmed, independently, the same inconsistencies I had identified. For 4 months, I built the file. By the 4th month, I had documented 37 bottles with evidence of adulteration or content substitution. I had the corresponding sales records which I was able to reconstruct from the order slips in the point-of-sale system, which I administered as part of my responsibilities. I had the total amount billed to clients for those 37 bottles compared with the estimated real value of the contents the bottles actually contained. The difference was an amount representing only the cases I had been able to document directly. If the pattern held in the restaurant's history, which was reasonable to assume given the level of organization of the scheme, the accumulated fraud was of a significantly larger magnitude. I went to Fontaine with a selection of a documentation. What I expected was denial. What I got was the thread I described at the beginning. The 3 calls I made from the parking lot that afternoon were these. The first was to Attorney Martinez, a lawyer specializing in labor and immigration law who had been recommended to me by a colleague a year earlier, and whose contact details I had saved without knowing I was going to need them. I explained the situation in 10 minutes. She told me that Fontaine's immigration threat was largely a bluff, that my visa situation was completely regular and that he had no direct legal mechanisms to affect it, but that it was important to document the threat immediately and proceed quickly. The second was to the regional delegate of the International Sommelier Association, of which I am a certified member. The association has specific protocols for fraud cases in the sector because high-end wine fraud is a known problem in the industry, and there are established mechanisms for handling it that include coordination with consumer protection authorities and with origin certification bodies. The third was to a contact I had at the city's customs authority, an inspector I had met at a seminar on authentication of imported products and with whom I had maintained sporadic professional contact. I described the type of fraud in general terms and asked what the correct process was for reporting adulteration of high-end imported products. He described the process. He told me it was exactly the kind of case they were interested in. What followed was coordinated in a way I could never have fully anticipated when I started documenting 4 months earlier. The International Sommelier Association opened a formal investigation based on my report and the documentation I provided. That investigation carried the weight of a body with recognized technical credibility and the capacity to request laboratory analysis of the samples I had preserved. The laboratory analyses confirmed what my organoleptic observations and those of my colleagues had indicated. The contents of the analyzed bottles did not correspond with the designation of origin or with the analytical characteristics of the producer indicated on the labels. Customs initiated a parallel investigation process for the importation and commercialization of adulterated products, which is an offense under the Consumer Protection Code, with both civil and criminal consequences. Attorney Martinez simultaneously filed a complaint with the Consumer Protection Authority and a criminal complaint for commercial fraud. And as a precautionary measure requested by customs, the restaurant was subjected to an inventory audit that discovered a volume of adulterated bottles significantly larger than the 37 I had documented directly. Fontaine attempted to activate the immigration threat. He filed a complaint with the immigration authority alleging irregularities in my work contract. What he did not calculate was that Attorney Martinez had anticipated that move and had prepared a documented response demonstrating that my employment situation was completely regular and that Fontaine's complaint was manifestly retaliatory and chronologically subsequent to my report, which configured it as an attempt to obstruct an ongoing investigation. The immigration authority archived the complaint, and the attempted retaliation was documented as part of the criminal file as additional evidence of Fontaine's conduct. That move, which he thought was his strongest card, became one of the most damaging pieces of evidence against his case. The legal process lasted 16 months. Fontaine was convicted of commercial fraud and adulteration of imported products. The sentence included fines of a magnitude calculated on the total value of the fraud reconstructed by the investigators, which turned out to be several times larger than what I had directly documented. The restaurant's most important star was withdrawn by the corresponding guide after the case became public. The restaurant closed 6 months after the conviction. Affected clients were notified, and several initiated their own civil claims. My visa was not affected. My professional reputation was not either. On the contrary, the case generated visibility in the sector that I could not have built any other way. The willingness to report a fraud of this magnitude with solid technical documentation, in a context where visa dependency could have justified silence, generated a kind of credibility that is difficult to build any other way. Today I work at another establishment, with better conditions, with my name on the wine list as head sommelier. And every bottle I open I examine with the same attention as always. Sometimes out of passion, always out of principle. If this story left you with your jaw on the floor, comment. Would you have spoken up or stayed silent out of fear? Like if you believe consumer fraud deserves real consequences. Subscribe for more real stories. Share with someone who works in hospitality or in the luxury sector and needs to know they have options. Practical tip. If you are a consumer of high-end wine or imported luxury products, educate yourself about the basic signs of authenticity. Designations of origin have verification bodies. If you have doubts about the authenticity of a high-end product you paid a collector price for, you have a right to make a claim, and there are consumer protection bodies that receive these reports.